Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for that very warm introduction. So I'd like to begin with you're having just a look at this poem from 1873. I'm not going to read it. I'll just let you have a glance at it. I'll point out as you're reading the author, Apoth E. Carey. Anybody get the joke? So it's a reference to patent medicine, which was so common in the late 19th century, and as you may recall, not particularly effective most of the time. Often, effective for its purposes that were supposedly stated. It usually was very filled with alcohol. The point of this poem is that deception is a hardy perennial in any human society, and certainly amid any capitalist society. And I suspect that you can testify to this in your own experience. Somehow I imagine most of you have encountered the telemarketing scam in your life, or the fish on your email, that's a PH, trying to lure you into an ill-advised click. Our world is filled with corporate accounting scandals. The newspapers discuss them on a regular basis. We've had a lot of historical work on the incidence of fraud in modern capitalist societies. Mostly they've been microhistories. They've been attempts to get at the story of Ponzi or the collapse of Enron. There are several books of that sort out right now, actually. Those books tend to have fascinating characters, compelling plot lines. They make for great reading. They're great stories. They speak to the enormous human ingenuity that goes into cooking up new kinds of frauds, the vulnerability of many people to them, and often the cruelty associated with these particular episodes. And the book that I've written includes dozens of these types of incidents and episodes. But instead of doing microhistory, I'm much more interested in macrohistory, thinking about patterns over time, key turning points, and enduring continuities. I see two big advantages here, and those are separate from the fact that if you look carefully, you'll notice that P.T. Barnum and Bernard Madoff look a lot alike. So the first big advantage is that you get to see a sense, if you look over 200 years at a society like the United States, you get a better understanding of what stays the same. What kinds of issues don't go away, recur from generation to generation. And secondly, you get a much better insight on the changing institutional responses to the problem of deception in the marketplace. And so the book that I've written tries to get at both of these things, and I'm going to give you a brief sense of those in the time that we have this afternoon. Let me begin with a point about continuity. Fraud turns out to be really durable in form. The pump and dump really hasn't changed very much as a mode of financial fraud from the late 19th century, really the late 17th century, to the present. So on one side you see a cartoon referencing mining frauds in the late 19th century. On the other side, still not so recent film anymore, engaging with fraudulent stock pitches associated with the craziness of the 1990s and 2000s. Similarly, not too much difference really in the methods of what you might think of as managerial control fraud. What one cartoonist in the 1880s referred to as the technique of smash and bang. Get control of a company, engage in insider dealing, create companion companies that will buy your goods, perhaps manipulate the stock with inside information. Over and over and over again, it's a story of smash bang, whether in the 1880s or the 1920s, or more recently in our time. With consumer fraud, once again, the tactics don't change very much. The bait and switch is a hardy perennial, whether you're selling lightning rods to farmers in the mid-19th century or the latest television to a suburban housewife in the 1950s. Lure somebody in, get them over the threshold, which could be a store, or it could be going out to someone's house, or it could be just engaging with them now online. Give them enough of a lure to get them to look at something seriously, and then when time comes for the transaction, engage in some type of switch. It might be that the written terms of the contract are different from the oral promises. It might be that the advertised model turns out not to be available, but this other one is such a much better deal, really, for the money. These tactics don't change. I will say that the stories change enormously. They have to be authentic, and that means paying very close attention to the specifics in the given social moment. Another indication of continuity is just how effectively people engage in what I've termed social mimicry. This is an example from a pamphlet sent out by a mail order investment firm from New York in the late 1870s. And you'll see here that there are several things about this that I think are quite telling and common. So where is Baxter & Company located? Well, New York City, of course. That's where the capital of capital is. And where in New York City? Well, it's on Wall Street. And it's right next to the stock exchange, which the building only built in 1864, as opposed to the one that Baxter Company has, much bigger. And it was established in a much earlier time frame, more solid, right? All of these cues that are being sent out that this is a firm you can trust. One further point about continuity before I turn to the question of institutional change, and that's the remarkably consistent relationship between fraud and the frontiers of innovation. Where do you find fraudulent companies? Over and over and over again, it's not in the established part of the economy, it's in the new part of the economy. Why is this? Several reasons. First of all, it's the new part of the economy where the future is uncertain, where people have a very clear sense that there's money to be made, that the world's going to be different. It's going to be different because the automobile is going to make it different, for example. But everyone isn't completely sure about what the right strategy is to pursue or which technology is going to win out. That new economic vista creates enthusiasm. Enthusiasm that the most effective sellers take advantage of. Their dreams of big profits. Also, particularly large gaps in access to information. Their insiders have a bigger advantage in these contexts. And because there's so much uncertainty, it's often difficult to distinguish the puffer, the person who's just really optimistic and maybe overshooting the mark, or the firm that fails because of misfortune from intentional deceit, the hallmark of fraud. Okay, so that gives you at least some sense of the enduring character of fraud in capitalist societies. One I might add that I would argue is linked to psychological vulnerabilities that we all have. Why does the bait and switch work? Because we're all subject to anchoring heuristics. The promise of something that's free really grabs our attention. When it turns out not to be, we have a tendency, unless we have a sober second thought involved, to go along with the pitch. The institutional responses to fraud, however, have been very different across the breadth of American history. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that now. The method in the book is one of looking to identify what I refer to as policy regimes or regulatory ecologies, the cluster of rules and institutions in any given era that hang together for a sort of consistent approach to this problem. What I'm also very interested in trying to track is not just law in the books, but law as people use it, and what it means for firms and for consumers and for investors, and how they interact with what the institutions are and help to shape them over time. And what I see over and over again is something that I refer to as a policy dialectic, in which new kinds of circumstances generate critiques or reforms of the current institutional structure. And ideas pop up as ways that one might imagine reconfiguring what the law is or what the institutional structure is to deal with those problems concerning commercial deception, which eventually get a sufficient coalition to become law and to be implemented. And that changes the marketplace in ways that lead to new kinds of problems, new critiques, and so on. And typically this takes place over a generational timescale. It's between 20 and 40, 50 years for any one of these policy ecologies to consolidate and then come under attack and then be replaced. The other point is enduring, that's very important to me, is identifying enduring policy trade-offs. And these are just the need to balance a set of interests against each other that you can see more powerfully if you trace it, the dynamic over a full couple of centuries, as I have in the book. All right, so I've identified, I think, 5 different periods. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one. I'm going to start with the beginning of the book, which is in the early 19th century. So let's begin with that time and what I would refer to as an era of de facto caveat emptor. What I mean by that is not that the law was narrowly caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, but rather that while there was anti-fraud law on the books, it was really hard to make use of. The costs associated with bringing a case were quite high. And the gauntlet you had to go through, whether to bring a criminal case or a civil case, often made it difficult for a complainant to make a case stick. So let's start with a comment from P.T. Barnum from his first autobiography. He wrote 3 of them. And I'm going to just read the bottom part of the quote. Each party expected to be cheated if it were possible. Our eyes and not our ears had to be our masters. We must believe little that we saw and less that we heard. This is a world in which one does not run to bring a lawsuit every time you get the bad end of the stick. There are many reasons why this was the world that was in place. For one thing, information gaps were far less in the 19th century than they became later. It was possible to have a close look at a fabric and get a sense of what its quality was. And it was relatively straightforward for consumers to become reasonably knowledgeable about that. But there were policy rationales between this emphasis on having buyers and investors beware. This gave leeway to firms to engage in puffing and exaggeration. It was grease for risk-taking. It made it easier for new ideas to emerge in the marketplace. And it put the onus of prevention on individuals. People were supposed to be educated in the school, in this case not of hard knocks, but wily ruses. To sort of look out for what if somebody's trying to sell you something, you had to be on your guard, you had to be careful. And it meant that if you were burned in a given instance, well, that was a tough lesson that presumably would make you more vigilant later on. All of this, the backdrop for all of this is a world that emphasized citizenship as one associated with manly behavior, and a world that emphasized that adult white men were the prototypical citizens. So there were some consequences associated with this policy regime or regulatory ecology. For one thing, it actually spurred a lot of business innovation in order to close whatever information gaps existed. Sometimes that was done by businesses themselves, who, when threatened by imitations, would advertise to their consumers to look out for the legitimate article, not the fake one. It meant lots of interest in business services that could certify reputation in a world in which information was always asymmetric. So that meant credit reporting as a business entity, which emerged in the United States as early as the 1830s in order to give creditors a sense of whether they could trust far-flung debtors. It meant the emergence of accounting as a profession and the expansion of it in the late 19th century. And it meant as well the emergence of a different kind of public discourse. So you see the press at various levels, newspapers, trade journals, stepping up to become providers of information to allow people to be more sensible consumers and investors. This is an ad, actually, for a new journal, Electricity, in the 1890s, that actually appeared in a beekeeper's journal, believe it or not. But notice the key reason that you should subscribe to this. Boy, electricity is this new area. Nobody really understands it. Implicitly, what it's saying is there's all this uncertainty out there, and people are taking advantage of other people. If you subscribe to our journal, we'll keep you safe because we'll keep you posted on frauds and humbugs. Now, can we trust the Electricity Journal? There's always that further problem, right? If there's a sentinel who's acting on your behalf, how can you know that he's trustworthy? If the accountant tells you the books are good, how can you make sure that message is to be believed? The gatekeeper is always someone who could become corrupted. And whoever has reputation can trade on it. That's part of this environment. In fact, one of the things that emerges by the late 19th century is one of the most sophisticated dimensions of fraudulent strategy, which is setting yourself up as the fraud sentinel in order to push your fraudulent product. This happens in the financial markets. It happens in the patent medicine business, right? So here's a nice ad from right around the turn of the century. Caution, there are all these fraudulent advertising doctors out there, medical companies who have spurious products. And then it tries to sell you what it's selling, which basically treats every conceivable ailment under the sun. So the problem here is that you can't, at least the problem by the late 19th century, even as early as the 1860s, 1850s in some markets, is that for many observers, these reputational dynamics don't work well enough because of this possibility of corruption. And so what you begin to see, one last comment about this, another amplification of the dangers in the marketplace is the emergence by the 1880s, 1890s of suckers lists, so that you find people who are particularly vulnerable to these types of pitches, and then you sell that information in the marketplace. Of course, it's also the case, how can you trust a suckers list? How do you know that your suckers list is actually really suckers? It's an interesting problem. Okay, so by this latter part of the 19th century, a growing number of individuals in American society are getting sufficiently concerned about fraud as a problem that they want the government to do more about it. And that tends to be not just one group, it tends to be a coalition in a given area. Almost always business interests are involved. Almost always there are experts of one kind or another. Sometimes those experts actually are in the government already. Sometimes they're in universities. Sometimes coming from other parts of society. And what emerges is a set of proposals for some type of way of dealing with fraud that's new, and that often involves exercise of new kinds of state regulatory power. And the arguments are twofold. One is that what's going on is not fair to legitimate businesses. They're being harmed because of the depredations of their unfair competitors. And the second is that it's undermining more general confidence in a given market. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of this really quickly that I discussed in the book. The first, bird droppings. Guano, the most important innovation, one might argue, in many agricultural markets in the mid-19th century because it's so dramatically improved yields. Here's the problem, though. Where does guano come from? It comes from islands off of South America, concentrated bird droppings that are very high in crucial chemicals that then help for the yields of plants. How do you tell whether it's real guano or not? How do you tell whether it's just, got the right color and it looks like guano but doesn't have the nitrogen that it's supposed to have? Farmers can't figure that out. Not in 1857, not in Connecticut for the great majority of people. And what emerges is a set of arguments developed by agricultural societies in conjunction with this new field of chemistry, mostly from chemists who'd been trained in France or Germany and come back to the United States, that there's a solution here, and the solution is expert inspection. But who's going to pay for that? Well, the argument is the taxpayers should pay for it. And what should that look like? It should be the creation of a new regulatory agency in state governments, which spread right across the country in the late 19th century, in order to create rules that require the inspection of these, of people selling this, and then later also artificial fertilizers being made out of bone meal and other kinds of offal. That's OFFAL. And so what emerges right across America is an anti-fertilizer regulatory regime that has penalties and inspections and also mechanisms for individuals to bring, in many states, allegations into court on their own. And this eventually it becomes part of the market. If you're selling fertilizer, you want it known that your product is well thought of by the professional chemist who works for the state. Second example, the problem of mail fraud. So mail order grows by leaps and bounds in the mid-19th century as the post just gets better, more efficient, and cheaper, partly because of public subsidies. And so now you've got the opportunity for businesses to sell to a market that is really far-flung, that is hundreds, even more than 1,000 miles away. Well, now you've got new problems for information asymmetry. How can I check up on this firm that's making promises to me that's based in Kansas City, but I'm in Chicago? And this becomes a huge problem for the post office, actually, because when there's fraud that happens, many fraudulent businesses say, oh no, we sent the goods. It must be that the post office just lost them, or they couldn't, we all know how bad the post office is. And so what emerged was a coalition here that was really mostly from within the post office to create new regulatory authority, both criminal and civil, to attack the problem of lying through mail order commerce. And that starts in 1872 with criminalizing mail fraud, making that a federal crime, and creating an administrative order that probably most of you have never heard of, but that still exists, called the fraud order, which enables the United States government to deny you access to the mails as an administrative process, not as a criminal process. And so what happened by the late 19th, this is an early 20th century letter, is if you had a fraud order against you and you tried to use the mail, someone tried to send it to you, a mail to you, it would just go back with this accusing finger and the word fraudulent on it. All right, third example. This is outside the state, although linked to it. Huge problem with false advertising in the late 19th century, got even worse in the early 20th century. Department stores started worrying about it, major department stores. Some investment banks started worrying about it with regard to long-distance securities marketing. And there were lots of proposals emerging in state legislatures and at the federal level as well for pretty vigorous anti-false advertising legislation. In that context, businesses organized an organization that still exists and has a branch here in Raleigh, the Better Business Bureau, to provide a non-state mechanism of policing advertising. This wasn't completely separate from the state. Those same Better Business Bureaus lobbied for false advertising statutes that criminalized false advertising, which they then could take the leading role in policing. But they also effectively lobbied to deflect many proposals for more direct forms and more aggressive forms of administrative regulation. The key players here are not just department stores, they're reputable ad agencies, a number of retailers, the media, leading newspapers, magazines get very involved. They're concerned, I would argue, partly about their own social status because they're getting mixed up with this general public concern about the degree of deception in marketing and advertising. But they're also concerned about what's happening to more general consumer confidence and the evidence that people just weren't believing advertising at all because it was becoming the deception was becoming so rampant. Okay, so all of those examples involved fairly discrete markets. What happens in the context of the New Deal is a more general concern about confidence in the overall economy. So in the shadow of the Great Depression and the remarkable decline in economic output, a number of policymakers think there has to be a more vigorous anti-fraud posture from the federal government as part of the wider effort to get the economy up and running again. And this helps to underpin a lot of activity in Congress at the national level, but also collateral actions in the state. The two most important developments are the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission to police the securities markets, relying particularly on a disclosure strategy, also an anti-manipulation strategy. They're linked, but the disclosure strategy is more important, I would argue. And the expansion of authority for the Federal Trade Commission, which had been created earlier in the 19-teens. And I mean, this is a telling image for me because it gets at how vigorous both organizations were by the 1950s. This is a news clipping from the 1950s where anti-fraud policing, you just see it cheek by jowl, right next to each other, two different stories that are on the same page of the newspaper. Along with activity at the national government, though, there's a growing amount of anti-fraud effort at the state and local level too, creation of consumer protection agencies or anti-fraud divisions within the Office of Attorneys General. This is an example. By the way, this is totally bipartisan. Anybody know what party Louis Lefkowitz was? No, Louis Lefkowitz was a lifelong Republican. And held the position of Attorney General in New York State from the mid-1950s up into the 1970s. And this anti-fraud set of policies was crucial to his political success. You couldn't beat Louis Lefkowitz in New York.
Would you still say it's nonpartisan?
That's a great question. I'll come back to it maybe at the end, but I would say it depends. It depends. So one thing I want to stress here is that much of the action in the state level also was framed, and at the national level beyond the SEC and the FTC, was framed around disclosure strategies, right? So at the back of this, even from most Democrats, is about making markets work well, which means we need to just make sure that the gap of information is lessened. So there's a piece of legislation in the 1950s which says we want stickers on cars that says what their costs are and what the components are. And we want fair labeling. We want truth in labeling so that people know what they're getting in the packet or the box. And we know we want truth in weights and measures. Now these all have regulatory regimes associated with them, but there's a really cohesive strategy here in most cases around focusing on improving disclosure. What's going on as well is a growing impact of a consumer movement that's operating, especially in urban America. And that's putting pressure on the system and really trying to focus attention on thinking more creatively about how to level the playing field between buyers and sellers in different situations. All right, so let me just say a word about the impact of all of this anti-fraud activity in this period. It's not that fraud went away, that's for sure. But the worst examples in the mid-20th century tended to be fly-by-night firms. Or this is one of the biggest examples that I know of. So this is the company, the Holland Furnace Company, that had a particularly predatory sales approach. They would send people out to homes, knock on the door, try and convince them that they were government inspectors. They needed to see the furnace. Get down to the bottom of the furnace. You'd hear a lot of noise. You could kind of tell that things were being disassembled. Somebody would come up, then the guy would come up, and he'd be just completely filled with soot. And he would explain that, I'm sorry, I can't put your furnace back together. It would be too dangerous for you. You can't believe what I found. You're at risk. So if you look here, you're at risk maybe of a fire. Let's see, get that going. Yeah. Maybe your house is about to explode because of your furnace, or maybe you're just going to asphyxiate because of the fumes. Now what happens, so I can't put it back together again, I'm sorry, but I do have this really wonderful new furnace that will solve all of the problems, right? So this this went on for years and years and years. And actually, it's a nice example as well of some of the weaknesses of regulatory institutions, because the Federal Trade Commission looked at this company on more than one occasion and issued cease and desist orders, which they ignored. It took more than 25 years for this company really to be shut down. Only happened in the 1960s when more vigorous enforcement mechanisms occurred. That said, in current dollars, the annual cost to consumers from this company was probably in the millions, right? That's a lot. It's not in the billions. I'll come back to that. All right, so from the late 1970s onwards, and by the way, it's often a misconception that this starts with Reagan. It didn't start with Reagan. It started with Carter. Deregulation had a significant bipartisan character to it. You see a lot of pullback from regulatory stringency. Partly this is linked to a sense of ever overreaching government that is becoming problematic in the eyes of many conservatives in the United States, that we're building up a nanny state. I will note that while Ralph Nader is on the receiving end here, Ralph Nader also was open, at least some individuals associated with the consumer movement were open to aspects of deregulation, especially trucking, other transportation, railroads. So you get, by the late 1970s, really I would say for 30 years, a pretty powerful era of deregulatory impulses. Not in every instance, there are ebbs and flows, but I think it's fair to characterize it this way. And what emerges here, this is a response in part to stagflation and to economic problems in the 1970s. What it produces, in part, is openings for new deception. Bernard Madoff takes advantage of the temerity, really, I think is fair to say, of many people in the Securities and Exchange Commission for not really looking too closely at what he was up to. It's not that there were no complaints. There were complaints. They were deflected. And you see, in this period, quite a bit more large-scale fraud. I'll give you some of the examples here up on the screen, not in the millions in contemporary dollars, in the billions. It's a big difference in scale. Now, it might be that the advantages associated with pulling back from anti-fraud policy are worth it. You might have that view, but just note that there are definitely costs associated with the shift. Okay, very briefly, so we have some time for questions. Was 2008 a pivot? This is a question that I was thinking about a lot before 2016. Now I'm wondering whether 2016 was another pivot. Even if you just look at the Obama administration, it's a little unclear to me whether we should view 2008 as a really clear move away from deregulatory premises. On the one hand, the example that you're probably most familiar with, the financial crisis led to the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And that definitely had an anti-fraud element to it, no question about it. Are you all familiar with the Jobs Act? Some of you probably. So the same Congress that passed Dodd-Frank passed the Jobs Act, which really pulled back on many SEC rules around disclosure for firms that want to raise new capital. Right? So even that Congress, and that act passed overwhelmingly with the goal of expanding innovation in an economy that was on its back. So these impulses are complicated, and I think you can see dominant trends. But even during the era of deregulation, you had the savings and loan crisis that led to policy reforms. You had a number of corporate accounting scandals that led to Sarbanes-Oxley. And so here, getting back to your question, even in the 1990s, a big focus on, and 2000s, a big focus on elder fraud from Republicans as well as Democrats. Because here's a constituency where the concern about information gaps is particularly great for those who are experiencing cognitive decline. All right, bigger picture. And then we'll get to some exchange of ideas and some discussion. what do I think this whole story offers to policymakers and to people who study capitalism more generally? One is we have to really engage with behavioral economics. Rational behavior absolutely exists in marketplaces, and irrational behavior absolutely exists in marketplaces. And we need to understand when one obtains and when the other, because that's really important for how we construct institutions to deal with structuring our marketplaces. A second point, reputational checks are wonderful things in markets. They can really be part of the equation, and they are not panaceas. Because every time you build up reputation, you can trade on it. Or someone can pretend to be you. Third point, one that I refer to as generational amnesia. We tend to forget. The Great Depression had an enormous impact on the securities markets. If you look at how people operated in bond markets, how investment bankers approached their responsibilities in the 1950s, 1960s, the people making decisions saw what happened in the early 1930s. They remembered it, it was in their bones. We don't have anybody alive now who's got positions of authority who was there then. We don't know what that's like. We know what 2007-8 was like, but because Ben Bernanke had studied the response to the Great Depression, not really so much the origins of it, we got sufficiently vigorous monetary policy that we didn't get the 30% unemployment that we were looking at as a possibility in 2008. Third point, there's no easy approach here. You want to tackle fraud in a really vigorous way, you're going to inevitably hurt something else. The fraud order. I'll start with the second point, the rule of law. Initially, when the fraud order came into effect, a postal officer, an inspector could become convinced that you were doing dodgy stuff. He could let somebody up the chain know. There'd be a fraud order. How would you know? Because you would get an envelope coming back at you with the accusatory finger. No due process at all. No notice, no hearing. Well, that's not consistent with other American values. What happened over time was building process in so that there would be a notice and there would be a hearing. But now it takes months to get a fraud order. And while the months are going by, people are being taken advantage of. It's a trade-off. Entrepreneurial freedom. You want more of it, you're going to have more fraud. You want less fraud, you're going to be telling people they can't say certain things. That's a trade-off. You have to balance it. There's no other approach. A key point that I think is really underappreciated, we have an enormous array of self-regulatory institutions in the United States that have emerged in conjunction with state authority. They can often do an incredibly effective job. They sometimes identify so closely with the industries that they're connected to that maybe not so much. It's really important to distinguish when they can be helpful and useful and when they're more of a problem. Last 2 points. As I've already mentioned, the dominant approach in America has been, for dealing with the problem of fraud, has been improving disclosure. And I think that's really crucial. I think that's the best way to do it because it then is giving people the right kinds of tools to make good decisions. That said, if you don't have some type of framework to deal with the most predatory people in the marketplace, you're going to have problems. And finally, we just need a lot more comparison between what goes on in the United States and what goes on elsewhere. And I'll just leave you with this slide, more recent one. So this is, to me, really ironic because the point about cryptocurrencies is they're actually supposed to be invulnerable to fraud, right? And yet because, again, the new frontier, how many of you really understand how cryptocurrencies work? Probably very few. I don't feel like I do, even though I've read a lot about them. I don't think I'm anywhere close to an expert. You can fake selling cryptocurrency. People have done it. They've created Ponzi schemes around it. The point here, though, is this is going on everywhere. This isn't just going on in the United States. It's going on in India. It's going on in Brazil. It's going on in China. And it's going to be really helpful in thinking about how we can best design institutions for this ever-evolving set of problems if we're also aware of what's going on in other countries. So with that, I'll stop and I'll ask for your questions. Yes?
I'm looking at the other side of it. I'm looking at us, the consumers. Have we put our lives on autopilot? Because you're got all the organizations out there to protect us, and we go into these transactions, listen to what you say. Believe me, there's someone out there watching to make sure you don't screw me. And when that doesn't get happening, and I guess our parents might have been more suspect of what they bought into.
Maybe. I mean, it's also true that there is more information available now than ever before. But that's a challenge as much as an opportunity because there's so much of it. How many of you have really read the 100 pages of disclosures on some contract of adhesion that you've signed by clicking in just because you really would like to get the transaction over, right? So the disclosure is there, but it's not actually useful disclosure in the sense that anybody is really sifting through it. And also, it's a take it or leave it kind of situation often. There isn't, if you try and negotiate with with any large corporation about wanting to adjust clause 6B, Roman numeral 3.
I look at the size of the font when you see something on TV, and like an insurance thing, and it's like you can't even read it, and then it goes to the next screen. But they've done their part.
And so interestingly, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is largely about improving disclosure. But partly that's out of a sense that some defaults are helpful so that people can actually compare apples to apples. Yes?
You haven't mentioned the role of Yelp and all of these places you can go now.
Yes.
The consumers talking to each other about, and given that, how long can a fraud be sustained, given that we're in a world where people pick up on it very quickly and report it to everyone else?
This is a very good point. It's also true that you can game Yelp for a time, right? So now it's further true that Yelp can use algorithms to try and identify whether you have the hallmarks of someone who's a legitimate consumer or not. So this is an arms race that goes on over and over and over again. I will say that the same dynamic that you're describing with Yelp occurred in the Beekeeper's Journal that I referenced before. The editor would call out to the readers to say, hey, if you're seeing stuff going on in your community, let me know so that I can get the word back out and we can track whether they're products on the market that are spurious or individuals who are selling goods that are harmful to the community. And that's a great function. It's also true that Yelp is only as trustworthy as the people running Yelp. And they look at what Facebook just did with the reporting the impact of the turn to video on advertising. They just from what I read in the newspapers and the magazines, they just bald-faced lied about it. And this led a bunch of businesses to completely change their business models and tip them over the edge. There are many, many media companies that don't exist anymore because of that. It's complicated.
Don't you have the same problem with policing the police as when the government's being the police? In other words, it seems to be a huge public choice problem where you have a marriage of business. I mean, Gabriel Coco wrote
Sure.
great book, right? Basically pointing out how all the major regulatory agencies came about at the behest of big industries to protect the big industries at the time. And so, I mean, isn't it sort of an infinite recurrence?
Yeah, so I think that's right. It's not, but then do we throw up our hands or do we think about what's the right mix of institutions, public and private, in any given context? And I don't think that's a one-size-fits-all question either. Yes.
I know that you made reference to this during your timeline, but really, isn't it true throughout that much of the greatest, you refer to information asymmetries, which of course is where a lot of the fraud plays.
Sure.
But in particular, it's I can make money from you by selling you something once, as opposed to my business model requires that you be a repeat customer.
Mm.
You can defraud repeat customers, but it's harder. Because there's a feedback loop.
That's
As
right.
Roy was getting at, it isn't just you're taking it. I've never bought it. Roy has, so I'm going to ask Roy whether you're a reputable. I mean, if I've bought it before, I'm my own testimonial. I liked it. I didn't like it. It did what I thought, or so I thought. I understand that You can put fertilizer on your field, and you have every reason to believe that it worked, but actually it wasn't what it was advertised to be. But it seems to me the greatest risk involves the one, not necessarily fly-by-night, but certainly I sell you something one time, I don't have to earn your repeat trust. That's where I believe the greatest potential for fraud occurs.
I think you're absolutely right about that. That said, it can evolve with firms. So, take Sears now, gasping for breath, maybe, or not, right? Had a huge problem in developing trust in its early years, and did so even though it had a lot of dodgy practices. I opened the book with this moment in the mid-1890s where actually Richard Sears gets a fraud order because of some of those practices that he engaged in marketing. And this is a death sentence, right, for a mail order firm. No access to the mail is no business. And he made it go away, and a lot of the next 15 years was about building up trust, which then adheres across the 20th century, mid-20th century. But by the 1960s, there are dynamics within Sears that have led it to start engaging in some pretty dodgy marketing practices in some of its department stores. And so, a new set of problems. And you can build up that reputation and then face circumstances which lead you, because of competitive pressures or the particular approach of management, to trade on it. That's the further problem. You're absolutely right that once most people get singed, they remember, and it has an impact. And that's a market dynamic that's very important, which is why focusing on good disclosure is where most policy ends up going. But what do you do when there are people running really important central firms who, for whatever reason, personal or because of the challenges associated with the firm, start taking actions that threaten more general confidence? That can happen too.
I think your example about the video Facebook is a very recent example of something. I suppose their argument would be we weren't lying, we were exaggerating.
Well, they were
extrapolating from limited data or something like that.
Well, the interesting thing is they were unaccountable, and so this goes back to your point. Yes, there's no actor that you're going to be able to just sort of rest trust in. So the question is, how do you build structures of accountability that are at reasonable cost and give you the benefits that you want? And the thing about it's not like we haven't seen this story before. Newsflash, newspapers lied about their circulation in the 1880s and 90s and early 2000s, right? And part of the move toward the Better Business Bureau was saying, hey, there has to be truth in circulation. People have to actually be able to put some faith in these numbers that are coming out. And that's never going to happen unless there's some type of auditing framework. Now, is the auditing framework corruptible? You bet it is. But the question is how you can kind of optimize the oversight.
Time for one more question, Tom.
Have there been any cost-benefit analysis of legislation like truth in advertising, truth in labeling, that sort of thing?
So interestingly, we have a growing emphasis on cost-benefit analysis in administrative rulemaking at both the federal and state level. Not so much with legislation. Believe it or not, the institution in the globe right now that does this most comprehensively is the European Union. If you want to get legislation through the European Union, you got to do cost-benefit analysis at the front end before the legislation might even give rise to administrative rulemaking. It's also very hard to do. I would love to have precise measures of fraud. What's the problem with that? An awful lot of it never comes to light. Not reported. And so the argument that I made about the growth and the scale of fraud, and also I didn't make this point, it lodging in some of the most well-known and important corporations in the United States as compared to the mid-20th century is not nearly as precise an argument as I would like to be able to make. And so there may be opportunities for thinking more creatively about how to get proxies for this through one form of statistical analysis or another.